the moment Abigail Fletcher stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882, she already knew that every pair of eyes in town had a version of her story that was not her own. The dust kicked up around her boots as she gathered the single carpet bag that held everything left of her life: a change of clothes, a small Bible with her mother's handwriting pressed into the margins, and a folded letter of employment from the Red Mesa boarding house that had taken 3 months to arrange. She was 24 years old, and she had not said her own name aloud in mixed company without flinching since the summer of 1880, when a jury of 12 men in Dodge City had looked at her across a pine courtroom and decided that the truth, when spoken by a woman of her circumstances, was not worth the air it traveled on. The town of Caldwell smelled of horses, bread from the bakery on Front Street, and the ever-present iron tang of the cattle trail that ran just south of the main road. It was a working town, rough at its edges and proud of its roughness, and it looked at her with the flat, measuring gaze that new arrivals always received. She pulled her shawl tighter, not because of the cold — September was still warm this far south in Kansas — but because covering herself had become a habit she had not yet learned to break. The Red Mesa boarding house was run by a woman named Harriet Dunmore, who was wide in the hips and narrow in her judgments, and who had hired Abigail through a letter exchange with a women's charitable organization in Dodge City after her previous cook had eloped with a cattle buyer from Wichita. Harriet met her at the door with a handshake that was businesslike, and a look that was curious in the way that neighbors get curious when they already know more than they should. "You are the Fletcher woman," Harriet said, not unkindly. "I am Abigail," she replied, because that was the safest version of herself she could offer, not Fletcher, not the name that had been read aloud in a courtroom while the gallery murmured, just Abigail, small, contained, survivable. "Good. You will cook breakfast at 5:30 and supper at 6. Sunday breakfast is at 7. I do not run a saloon and I do not run a charity. You work, you eat, you sleep in the room off the kitchen. We understand each other." "We do," Abigail said, and she meant it. The trial had been 2 years ago, but the way time moved in small western towns, it might as well have been yesterday. In Dodge City, she had been the wife of Samuel Fletcher, a merchant of medium success and large temper, and when Samuel had been found dead in the storeroom of his own shop with a bullet in his chest, the sheriff had looked at the bruises on Abigail's wrists and arms and made a calculation that had nothing to do with justice. The truth, the real truth, was that a man named Harlan Bede, Samuel's business partner, had shot Samuel over a debt dispute, and Abigail had walked in on the aftermath. She had tried to save her husband. She had pressed her shawl against the wound. She had been covered in his blood when the deputy arrived, and that had been enough for a town that needed an answer quickly and conveniently. Harlan Bede had stood in that courtroom and told a story so smooth and practiced that Abigail had almost believed it herself. He said she had confessed to him. He said he had heard her threaten Samuel the previous week. He said Samuel had confided his fears about her. And the jury, 12 men who knew Harlan Bede at the poker table and the barber shop and the church pew, had believed him. She had been acquitted, eventually. A circuit judge named Harold Prentice had thrown out the case during the second session, when new testimony came forward from a traveling salesman who had seen Harlan Bede's horse tied outside the back of Fletcher's dry goods at the time the shot was fired. But by then the acquittal felt less like rescue and more like a door opening onto a burned field. Harlan Bede had left Dodge City 2 steps ahead of his own arrest on a different charge. Samuel was still dead. The neighbors still looked at windows when she walked by. And Abigail Fletcher had learned, in the way that women learn things without anyone ever teaching them directly, that her name could be a weapon held against her. So she had come to Caldwell. She scrubbed pots the first night until her hands were raw, and she found that she was grateful for the work. The kitchen was familiar territory, and it asked nothing of her but competence. The boarding house had 8 regular tenants, 2 cattle drovers between jobs, a land surveyor, a telegraph operator named Emmett Walsh, a retired schoolteacher who never came to meals on time, and 3 other men whose occupations shifted depending on what the season demanded. None of them were unkind to her face that first evening. Several of them were pointedly quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are waiting to see what kind of woman you turn out to be. She was awake before for the next morning, the sky still the dark blue of deep water, and she had biscuits in the oven and salt pork in the pan by the time the first boarders came down the stairs. There was a satisfaction in the early hours that the rest of the day could not quite match. Before the world woke up, she was just a woman cooking. No history, no trial, no name that preceded her like weather. It was on her 3rd morning in Caldwell that she met Cyrus Haskins. He came through the front door of the boarding house at 6 in the morning, which was not a normal thing for a non-boarder to do, and Harriet Dunmore came bustling down the hall with her arms crossed and her expression already prepared for irritation. But when she saw who it was, her expression changed into something softer and she uncrossed her arms. "Cyrus," she said, "you are early." "Harriet," he said, removing his hat. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had spent years speaking over wind and distance. "I came to see about the wagon wheel. Emmett said your rear axle is cracked again." "It is, and I need it fixed before Thursday's delivery run. Come in, come in." "Have you eaten?" He was 31 years old. She would learn this later, with dark brown hair that needed a trim and hands that showed their work in every callous and healed cut. He was not the tallest man she had ever seen, but he carried himself with an easy straightness that made him seem solid in a way that had nothing to do with size. He wore a brown canvas jacket over a blue shirt and the kind of boots that had been resoled at least twice. When he stepped through into the kitchen hallway, he nearly walked into her. She had been carrying a pot of coffee from the stove to the dining table, and she stopped short, and he stopped short, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could see the way the morning light caught the angle of his jaw. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," he said immediately, stepping back, his hat still in his hand. "No harm done," she said, and stepped around him. She did not look back. She was aware of Harriet watching with the particular attention of a woman who notices things, and she had no interest in being noticed in that particular way. Not yet, possibly not ever. The machinery of her heart had been disassembled and partially reassembled since the trial, and the parts did not all fit the way they once had. Harriet sat Cyrus down at the kitchen table while Abigail served the dining room, and when she came back through, he was eating biscuits with the focused appreciation of a man who had been eating his own cooking for a long time. He looked up when she refilled the coffee cup she had poured for him, and he said, "These are good biscuits," with a directness that was neither flirtatious nor polite for politeness's sake. He simply meant it. "Thank you," she said, and went back to the stove. He left after an hour, with a note from Harriet about the wagon, and Abigail watched him through the kitchen window as he walked across the dusty yard to look at the broken axle on the old supply wagon. He crouched down beside it and ran a hand along the crack with an expression of professional diagnosis, the same way she imagined a doctor might look at a wound. He seemed, from this distance, like a man who fixed things as a matter of principle. She turned back to her dishes. Harriet told her about him over the supper preparations that evening, in the sideways manner in which women share information about men they consider worth something. Cyrus Haskins ran the livery stable and repair shop at the south end of Front Street. He had come to Caldwell 4 years ago from Texas, where he had worked cattle drives for a decade, before deciding that he wanted a thing he could own and stand in rather than a thing he could only move across. He had no family in town, no wife, a detail Harriet offered with only a slight pause which Abigail chose to ignore, and he was considered by the general community to be a man of good character, which in a frontier town meant he paid his debts, did not drink to excess, did not cheat at cards, and did not mistreat anyone who worked for him. "He has been kind to people," Harriet said, in a tone that suggested she was putting emphasis on the word kind because it was rarer than it ought to be. "That is good," Abigail said, not taking the bait. He fixed our pump last spring without charging me the full labor rate because he knew I was coming off a hard winter. That is the kind of man he is," said Abigail. Harriet smiled at the boiling pot in a way that was directed at Abigail and let the subject rest. The weeks settled into a rhythm. Abigail cooked and cleaned and mended and managed, and she was good at all of it. And gradually the boarding house tenants stopped treating her with the careful neutrality of strangers and started treating her with the comfortable familiarity of people who have decided you belong. Emmett Walsh, the telegraph operator, took to leaving wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill on his way to work in the mornings, because he was the kind of man who did small kind things without making a production of them. The retired schoolteacher, a Mr. Edgar Beaumont, began leaving her books on the kitchen table with slips of paper marking pages he thought she might enjoy. The cattle drovers nodded to her when they passed and called her ma'am with genuine respect, but the town of Caldwell itself was a different geography. She first encountered the wider knowledge of her situation 3 weeks after her arrival, when she went to the general store on a Tuesday morning to purchase supplies for the boarding house. The store was run by a couple named Patterson, Franklin and Dot Patterson, and it was the kind of establishment where news traveled faster than weather. She was standing at the counter waiting for her order to be filled when she heard, from the next aisle, a woman's voice pitched at just the register that intended to be heard. "That is the Fletcher woman from Dodge City. You know what happened there?" A second voice lower asking something she could not make out. "Her husband," the first voice said, "dead in his own store. She was acquitted, but you know what acquitted means. It means they could not prove it, not that it did not happen." The silence that followed was the worst part, because it was the silence of someone considering this and finding it acceptable. Abigail took her wrapped supplies from Franklin Patterson, who had the decency to look uncomfortable, and she walked out of the store with her head at exactly the level it had been when she walked in. Not high, not low, calibrated. She had learned how to make herself invisible to judgment while still being physically present, and she employed the skill now with a precision that took her all the way back to the boarding house kitchen, where she set down the supplies and stood very still over the sink for a moment with her hands on the edge of it. She did not cry. She had used up most of her crying in 1880. Cyrus came to the boarding house twice more in October, both times for practical reasons, the wagon wheel, and then a problem with the water pump that Harriet had apparently referred to him after he had fixed it so well the previous spring. Each time he spoke to her when their paths crossed with the same direct simplicity he had used in that first encounter. He asked if she had found the town to her liking. She said it was coming along. He mentioned that the best view of the prairie was from the rise north of the cattle pens in the early morning, before the dust came up. She said she would have to go early then, since she was usually at the stove by 4. He said the truly good views were worth the early start. That was not a conversation with hidden meanings. She checked it carefully afterward and determined that it was simply a man sharing information about a landscape he found beautiful, in the way that people do when they want to offer something they cannot wrap up and hand over. And yet she found herself thinking about it later, in the gaps between tasks, not with the flush of early attraction, but with something quieter, a noticing, like finding an unexpected lamp in a dark hall. November brought cold that moved across the plains like a slow curtain being drawn, and with it came the cattle market season's wind down and the long hours of winter preparation. Abigail found extra work mending clothes for several of the town's families, which Harriet approved because it brought in money and kept her boarder occupied, which in Harriet's estimation was the same thing as keeping her happy. It was during a mending afternoon in late November that she first had a real conversation with Cyrus, not the brief exchanges of practical people passing in functional spaces, but an actual conversation with length and weight to it. She was sitting on the boarding house porch in the last of the afternoon light, her hands working a needle through a cotton shirt, when he came around the corner from the side yard where he had been helping Emmett Walsh patch a section of fence. She had not known he was there, and he had not known she was there, and they both registered the other's presence at the same moment. "I thought everyone would be inside by now," he said, which was honest rather than apologetic. "The light is better out here for another 20 minutes, she said, holding up the shirt. "After that I will go in." He leaned against the porch post, still holding the fence post driver he had been using. He was not trying to start a conversation. He was simply tired and the resting felt natural, and yet the quiet between them was comfortable rather than awkward, which surprised her slightly. "You from around Kansas originally?" he asked after a while. "Missouri," she said, "near Joplin. I came west when I was 20, a small editing of history but accurate at its edges. Long way from Joplin." "Yes. I am from a place near Laredo," he said, "which is about as far from anything as you can get while still being in Texas. People always said Laredo like it was a punishment." He said it without bitterness, just observation. "You get used to distance." "You do," she agreed, and found that she meant it on more levels than the geographic. He helped Emmett finish the fence and left before supper, and she thought about what he had said, not any particular thing he had said, but the quality of the saying. He had not asked her about the trial. He had not positioned himself as someone who had or had not heard things. He had simply talked to her the way he would talk to any person sitting on a porch in the late afternoon light, which was, she realized, a genuinely rare thing. December was cold and busy, and the boarding house was full with extra travelers taking shelter from a week of freezing rain, and she barely had time to surface from the demands of the kitchen. But on the Sunday of that wet week, when the rain hammered the roof, and the boarders were all inside, and Harriet had given her an hour to herself, she did something she had not done in a long time. She put on her coat and hat and walked down to the south end of Front Street and stood outside the livery stable, not intending to go in, simply walking. The stable door was open despite the cold, and there was lamplight inside, and she could see Cyrus standing at a workbench doing something with a piece of harness, leather and an awl. He worked steadily and without looking up, and there was something in the quality of his concentration that seemed, from where she stood in the rain, like a kind of peace. She stood there for no more than 10 seconds before she realized she was staring, and she walked on. But the image stayed with her. A man in lamplight, working with his hands, at peace with what he was doing. She had not thought a simple scene like that could feel like something worth storing in memory. It did. She put it away carefully, like the books Mr. Beaumont left on the kitchen table, and went on with her days. The real shift began in January, after the town meeting. Caldwell held town meetings on the first Thursday of each month in the meeting hall above the hardware store, and in January the main item of business was a proposal from the town council to hire a second deputy, as the marshal was aging and the cattle season brought trouble every spring. Abigail was not invited. She had not expected to be, but the aftermath of the meeting traveled back to the boarding house through Emmett Walsh, who attended all such things as a matter of staying informed. There was a discussion about the new arrivals to town, Emmett said over his supper plate, with the careful tone of a man who knows he is carrying something fragile. Some folks brought up the matter of individuals with certain histories, not wanting to cause alarm in the community. Abigail kept her expression still and kept serving the table. Franklin Patterson said some things, Emmett continued, and then he seemed to think better of how he was delivering this and stopped and looked at her directly. "You should know that not everyone agreed with him. Some people spoke up." She looked at him. "Who?" "Cyrus Haskins," Emmett said simply. "He told Patterson that character is not a thing you inherit from a courtroom verdict, and that if Patterson wanted to run people out of town based on rumor, he was welcome to put it in writing and let the circuit judge decide if that was legal or otherwise. Patterson backed down pretty quick." She set down the plate she was carrying and was quiet for a moment. "He did not have to do that," she said. "No," Emmett agreed. "He did not." She thought about it all night, through the sounds of the boarding house settling and the wind pushing at the windows. He had spoken her history, not her name, not exactly, but close enough in front of the town meeting. He had placed himself between her and the easy cruelty of collective judgment without consulting her, without knowing whether she would want that or find it presumptuous or even be aware of it. He had done it because he thought it was right. She could not decide whether to feel grateful or exposed. Both feelings lived in her like fire on opposite sides of a wall. She met him 2 days later at the general store. He was there to pick up a hardware order, and she was there for the weekly boarding house supplies, and they arrived at the front counter at the same moment. Franklin Patterson was behind the counter, and he looked at them both with the expression of a man who is braced for a weather event. "Mr. Haskins," she said, because she owed him an acknowledgement and she was not a person who let debts go unpaid. "I heard what you said at the town meeting." He looked at her with those direct, quiet eyes. "I said what needed saying," he replied. "You did not have to." "In my experience," he said, accepting his paper-wrapped hardware order from Patterson, "the things you do not have to do are usually the ones that matter most." He touched the brim of his hat to her. "Good morning, miss. What do you prefer to be called?" The question surprised her. Not its content, but its delicacy. He was asking because he understood that names carried weight, and that she might have feelings about hers. "Abigail," she said, and then, with a steadiness that cost her something but felt worth the cost, "Abigail Fletcher." "Good morning, Abigail Fletcher," he said, and there was nothing in his face except genuine acknowledgement, as if her full name were a perfectly ordinary and respectable thing to say in a general store on a Thursday morning in January. She watched him go, and then turned to find Franklin Patterson looking at a spot above her right shoulder, which was the direction that guilty people look when they are hoping to avoid eye contact, and she picked up her own order and went back to the boarding house with something unfamiliar moving in her chest. It was not happiness, exactly. It was more like the earliest sign of thaw after a very long winter, the faint suggestion that something below the frozen ground might still be alive. She did not act on this feeling, because acting on feelings was something she had learned to approach with extreme caution. But she stopped redirecting her thoughts away from Cyrus Haskins when they drifted in his direction, which was, for her, a meaningful act of permission. February in Kansas was hard and cold, and the boarding house was a place of wood-stove warmth and close quarters, and the boarders developed the communal cabin fever intimacy of people who are stuck in a warm place together and have run out of ways to be strangers. Mr. Beaumont started reading aloud from his books after supper, which everyone pretended to be indifferent to, but nobody left the table during. Emmett taught a drover named Pete to play chess. The other drover, a broad and gentle man named Solomon who had come up from Arkansas on the cattle trail and stayed, helped Abigail carry firewood without being asked and became, over the course of February, something approaching a friend. Solomon was the one who told her that Cyrus had been asking after her. Not in a pursuing way, Solomon was careful to clarify, because Solomon was one of those rare men who understood nuance, but in the way that a person asks about someone they are thinking of without knowing exactly what to do with the thought. "He asked me how you were getting on," Solomon said, stacking wood in the lean-to. "Whether you were finding things easier." "I told him you were managing fine, because that is what you told me to tell people, but I also told him you had fixed the water pump fitting yourself last week when it froze, and that seemed to please him." "Pleased him," she repeated. "Man appreciates competence," Solomon said, with a shrug that contained a small smile. "Not always the case, but with that one I believe it is true." She thought about this with the same careful attention she gave to everything these days. Cyrus Haskins was not a man who said things he did not mean, as far as she could observe. He was not a man who performed interest without having it. He had defended her at the town meeting without seeking credit. He had asked her name and called it like it was worth calling. He asked after her well-being through a mutual acquaintance in the understated manner of a person who is aware of boundaries but is also perhaps hoping they are not permanent. She was 31 years old in November. He was 26. She had been so caught in survival that she had not properly looked at what was right in front of her. Wait, she corrected herself. She was 24. He was 31. She must keep the facts straight. The trial had been in 1880, she had come to Caldwell in 1882, and she was 24 years old. That was the truth of her arithmetic. She decided, somewhere in the stack of firewood and the cold February wind, that she would stop treating every approaching warmth as a probable trap. She would remain cautious, because some habits were wisdom rather than fear. But she would stop closing every door before she had looked through it. In March, when the worst of the winter broke and the mud season took its place, Cyrus Haskins began doing a thing that she would only understand later was entirely intentional. He began taking his noon meal at the boarding house. Harriet Dunmore offered noon meals on a pay-per-day basis to anyone in town who wanted them, and several townspeople took advantage on occasion. But Cyrus, who had not done so before February, started coming 3 days a week, then 4. He sat at the end of the long table and ate whatever she had cooked with the same straightforward appreciation he had shown for the biscuits on that first morning, and he engaged in the general conversation of the table without dominating it. And whenever their paths crossed in the kitchen or the hallway, he spoke to her with a naturalness that had the slow, deliberate quality of something being built on purpose. He told her about the horses at his livery. He had 2 that were particularly stubborn and one that was, in his words, smarter than most men he had worked alongside, which he did not say as a compliment to the horse so much as an honest assessment of both parties. She found herself laughing at this, actually laughing, the kind of laugh that comes from genuine surprise at being amused, and the sound of it startled her slightly because it had been infrequent enough to feel unfamiliar. He looked at her when she laughed as if he was noting the direction of a star he had been tracking for a while. She told him about Missouri, about the green of the Ozark Hills that she still sometimes dreamed about her mother, who had died of fever when Abigail was 19, and who had been the kind of woman who could make a kitchen feel like it was the most important room in any building she was in. He listened with the full attention of someone who is genuinely interested rather than waiting for his turn to speak. She did not tell him about the trial. Not yet. She needed to know whether he already knew, which she suspected he did, and whether what he already knew had changed anything about the way he saw her, which she suspected it had not. April arrived with mud that dried into ruts and wildflowers that pushed through the hard-packed ground south of town along the creek bed. And on an afternoon in mid-April, when the boarding house was quiet and her work was done, Abigail found herself on that rise north of the cattle pens that Cyrus had mentioned back in October. The view was as good as he had promised, a wide, rolling landscape of pale green grass and enormous sky. The kind of view that made you feel small in a way that was restoring rather than diminishing. She stood there for a while, and then she was not alone, because she heard footsteps on the dry grass and turned and found Cyrus coming up the rise with his hat in his hand and an expression of genuine surprise at finding her there. "You took the recommendation," he said. "I did," she said. "You were right about it." He stood beside her and they both looked at the prairie for a long moment, and the wind moved through the grass in long, soft waves, and the sky above them was the blue of something that has never been broken. "I owe you something," she said finally, "for the town meeting." "You do not," he said, without hesitation. "Let me disagree," she said, and he looked at her with a slight readiness in his expression as if he would listen. "You did not know me, you took a side." "I knew what I needed to know," he said. "I knew that Patterson was enjoying himself too much. Men like that are usually working from something other than principle." "He was working from what he had heard," she said carefully. "About me." "I know what he had heard," Cyrus said simply. And there it was, the confirmation that he had always known from well before January, from before the biscuits and the porch conversation and the noon meals. And the knowledge had apparently changed nothing about how he had chosen to interact with her. She looked at him directly, the way she had not let herself look at anyone directly in 2 years, and she said, "Then you know what the trial was?" "I know what people in Dodge City said it was," he replied. I also know that people in Dodge City said a lot of things that turned out to be wrong from what I have heard more recently. Harlan Bede confessed to the shooting, she said. Not to a court, but he let it be known when he left Kansas. Some people in Dodge heard it and the word traveled. I do not know how far. It traveled here, Cyrus said. Emmett Walsh knows every wire that comes through this territory, and he is not a man who keeps important things to himself when keeping them matters. He paused. I am sorry about what you went through. I am sorry that a jury of men who should have done better did not. She felt the back of her eyes burn, and she refused it, pressing her lips together and looking out at the prairie until the feeling passed. I survived it, she said. You did more than survive it, he said quietly. Surviving is just not dying. You came here, you work, you fix pump fittings in February, you make biscuits that are worth getting up early for. There was something in the last item of his list that was lighter than the rest, and she recognized it as his attempt to offer her a way back from the edge of something too heavy, and she was grateful for the skill of it. She almost reached out and touched his hand where it rested against the fence rail beside her. She did not. But she stayed standing there beside him for another hour, watching the prairie go golden in the afternoon light, and it was the most at peace she had felt in 2 years. May came in warm and generous, the way Kansas sometimes is before the summer heat decides to make a point of itself, and Caldwell filled up with the early traffic of cattle-seasoned drovers passing through, merchants doing a brisk business, the marshal hiring on extra help. The boarding house was full every night, and Abigail worked harder than she had since arriving, but she did not mind the work. Work had always been the place where she could exist without apology, and there was something about the fullness of the house now that felt like being part of something alive. Cyrus was busy too, his livery at full capacity with horses needing board and shoes and tack repair, men coming and going at all hours. But he still came for noon meals when he could, and when he missed them, she found herself noticing the absence in the way you notice a door that is usually open when it is unexpectedly closed. She noticed Solomon noticing her noticing, and she gave him a look that was meant to communicate that this was none of his business, and Solomon responded to the look with a smile so serene it was almost annoying. It was at the May market that it happened, the first real public acknowledgement of what had been quietly building between them. The Caldwell Spring Market was held the third weekend of May on the main street, with vendors and food sellers and a fiddle player outside the saloon who always played the same 6 songs in different orders. And the whole town turned out because there was not much entertainment, and people were grateful for any occasion that made the street feel festive. Abigail was there with a basket, buying butter and eggs from one of the farm women who sold at a table near the hardware store, and everything was ordinary until it was not. Dot Patterson Franklin's wife was standing with 2 other women near the bread seller's table, and when Abigail walked past, one of the women said something that Dot Patterson laughed at, and the laugh was aimed in Abigail's direction with the precision of a thrown stone. She kept walking. She had practice at this. But then she heard a voice behind her, unhurried and carrying, a voice that had enough natural volume to cross a street without effort. "Good morning, Abigail Fletcher." She turned. Cyrus was standing on the other side of the market street in front of the saddle maker's stall, and he had raised a hand in greeting, and he had said her name, both parts of her name, in a voice that carried to the women near the bread table and the men by the feed store, and the fiddle player who had paused between songs, and frankly, anyone on Front Street who was not hard of hearing. He said it without fanfare. He said it the way you say the name of someone who belongs where they are standing. He said it in front of the whole town of Caldwell, Kansas, on a Saturday morning in May of 1883, and for the first time in 3 years, her name sounded like what it was supposed to be, a name. Her name, something she owned rather than something that was owned by the courtroom and the gossips and the long shadow of a verdict she had not deserved. She stood taller. She could feel it happening in real time, some adjustment in her spine, some lifting in her chest, and she knew that anyone watching would see it, and she found that she did not mind. She did not mind at all. She walked across the street to where he was standing, and she said, "Good morning, Cyrus Haskins," and she let her own name settle in the air behind her and did not go back for it. They walked the market together for an hour, looking at goods and talking about nothing in particular: the price of butter, the quality of the early corn, a particularly fine-looking mare at the horse trader's stall that Cyrus examined with professional interest. People looked at them. Some people looked away. Some people nodded. Emmett Walsh, buying tobacco at the general store, gave Cyrus a small nod of what appeared to be approval, which Cyrus appeared not to notice or pretended not to. When they reached the end of the market street and the crowd thinned, Cyrus stopped and turned to her with a seriousness that his face wore naturally, without gravity. "I would like to call on you," he said, "if that would be agreeable to you." She looked at him for a long moment. This was the decision, not the feeling, not the slow warmth of months. Those were already determined. This was the moment of choosing to let something matter again, to risk being in a position where something could go wrong again, to put her name out into the world attached to hope rather than shame. "It would be agreeable," she said. He nodded once with the expression of someone who has just settled something important. "Sunday afternoon, then, if you are free after services." "I am free after services," she said. They walked back through the market separately, because she needed a moment alone with the size of what had just happened, and she bought her eggs and her butter and walked back to the boarding house and stood in the kitchen and found that she was smiling at the wall, which was not something she could remember doing in a very long time. Harriet Dunmore came in from the back door and looked at her and said, without preamble, he finally asked then, "Were you watching?" Abigail said, turning around. "I was at the cheese table," Harriet said, entirely without guilt. "I heard your name." A pause. "It sounded like it was supposed to." "Yes," Abigail said softly, "it did." Sunday arrived the way important days sometimes do, with the kind of ordinary morning that gives no outward sign of being anything other than itself, and yet everything about it feels selected. She wore her good dress, which was blue-gray calico, and pinned her hair properly instead of pulling it back in the quick practical knot she usually wore for cooking. She looked at herself in the small mirror in her room for longer than she usually allowed, and the woman looking back at her seemed not changed, but perhaps uncovered, the way a table looks when you remove the cloth that has been over it for too long. Cyrus came at 2 in the afternoon, hat in hand, wearing a clean shirt with a collar that had been pressed. He had brushed his hair. She noticed this with the attention that people give to small things when the small things are evidence of something larger. They walked out to the creek south of town, where the cottonwoods were just leafing out in that bright, almost translucent green of early summer, and the water ran clear over smooth stones, and it was as pleasant a setting as Kansas ever produced. He had brought a small bundle corn bread wrapped in cloth from the bakery on Front Street. "I did not want to bring you biscuits," he said, "since you make the best ones I have had, and it seemed like bringing coals to the furnace." She laughed again, and this time it did not startle her. She was getting used to laughing. It was coming back to her like a word in a language she had once spoken fluently. They sat on the grassy bank and ate the cornbread and talked with the ease of people who have been building toward ease for months and are now arriving at it. He told her about the drives he had done in his 20s, 12 years of cattle work up and down the Kisham Trail, sleeping under skies so full of stars you thought you were drowning in them upward, handling cattle that weighed 1,000 pounds each and had their own opinions about direction. He said it had been good work, and he did not regret it. But there came a time when a man needed a place to stand still, and standing still had turned out to be its own kind of adventure. She told him about her marriage. She had not intended to. She had thought she would save that for a different time, or perhaps never. But it came out with the natural momentum of a real conversation, which does not always wait for the convenient moment. She told him about Samuel Fletcher, about the dry goods store, about the years that had started as ordinary and become difficult in ways she had not known how to name at the time and could now name clearly. She told him about the bruises, and she watched his face while she told him, and what she saw was not the thing she had feared, which was pity that curled into suspicion. What she saw was a steady, quiet anger on her behalf that he was controlling with effort. "You do not need to be angry," she said. "I am choosing to be," he said. "It seems like the right response." "Samuel is dead," she said, "and Harlan Bede will answer to something eventually, whether it is a law or something larger. I have made peace with that." "Have you?" he asked, not challenging, just asking. She thought about it honestly. "I have made peace with the parts I can afford to," she said. "The rest I am working on." He nodded, and he reached out and placed his hand on the grass beside her hand, not touching, just near. A proximity offered as option. And she looked at his hand, and then she placed hers over it, and they sat like that for a while beside the water with the cottonwood leaves making their small rustling music above them. June turned Caldwell into a town of long days and short tempers among the cattle crowd, and the boarding house was a place of constant movement and noise. And Abigail worked through it all with a new kind of stamina that she recognized as the stamina of someone who has a reason to come home at the end of the day's work. She and Cyrus were walking out formally now, a recognized thing, a visible thing. And the town had largely arranged itself around this fact with the philosophical acceptance that small towns sometimes achieve when they decide a thing is settled, and there is no point debating it. Franklin Patterson made one more effort in June, at the general store, when Cyrus was there to pick up supplies, and Patterson made a comment about questionable histories being the foundation of questionable futures, clearly intended for both of them to hear. It was the kind of comment that a certain kind of man makes when he can see that he has lost the ground he was trying to hold and wants to damage something on his way out of the argument. Cyrus set down his package on the counter and looked at Patterson for a moment and said, quietly and without heat, "Franklin, I am going to buy my supplies and take them and go. But I want you to think carefully about whether the next thing you decide to say about Abigail Fletcher is a thing you want to be on the public record, because this town is smaller than you think and I have a good memory." Patterson said nothing. Cyrus picked up his package and tipped his hat at Patterson, who had the grace to look at the floor, and walked out. When Abigail heard about this from Emmett Walsh that evening, she did not feel the complicated, exposed gratitude she had felt in January. She felt something simpler. She felt that Cyrus Haskins was exactly the kind of man that she had stopped believing existed somewhere around 1880, and that believing in him was not foolishness but evidence. By July, the word love had not been said between them, but it was present in everything. It was in the way he always knew how she took her coffee by the time he had been coming for noon meals long enough to have noticed. It was in the way she had begun keeping a portion of the best biscuits wrapped for him when he was coming late. It was in the way their walks along the creek had developed a pattern and a language, with certain stones and trees that had acquired meaning through repetition. It was in the way she had stopped censoring her laughter, and the way he had started telling her harder things about the loneliness of the drives, about a brother in Texas he was not close to, about the particular sorrow of building something alone and not being sure what you were building it toward. "I have been building towards something," he said one evening on the rise north of the cattle pens where they had returned because it was their place now, the first place that had become theirs. "I just was not sure what it was for a while. And now," she said, looking at the prairie. "And now I am sure," he said. She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with everything in his face that he had been holding with such careful patience for 8 months, and she thought, here it is. Here is the thing that was buried under all that cold ground, still alive. "I love you, Abigail Fletcher," he said, and he said her full name, the way he always did all of it, the name and the surname, the thing that was hers, and he said it like the name itself was part of what he loved. She felt her chest open in a way that she had not felt since before the trial, since before everything had broken and been partially rebuilt. She felt it open like a window in spring. And she said, "I love you too, Cyrus Haskins," and said his full name back to him because it seemed like the right exchange. Name for name, whole for whole. He put his arms around her and she let herself be held, and the prairie evening settled around them with the enormous gentleness of sky and distance and wind in the grass. And she thought that she had come a very long way, through a very dark territory, to stand in this exact spot with this exact man, and that it had been worth every mile. August brought heat that made the tin roofs of Caldwell tick and sigh all night, and the cattle season wound toward its close, and the town began its long exhale toward autumn. Cyrus and Abigail continued their courtship with the steady confidence of people who know where they are going and are not in a particular hurry, because the destination is not in doubt, and the traveling is good. He asked her to marry him on an evening in late August, sitting on the steps of his livery stable after the last horse had been settled for the night, with the smell of hay and leather and horse around them, and the stars coming out overhead in their old, uncountable abundance. He had a ring, a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, who had died when he was 12, and which he had carried in a vest pocket for most of his adult life without knowing why, and which he now understood he had been carrying for exactly this purpose. He did not make a speech. He said, "I want to build something with you, something that is ours, if you will." She looked at the ring in his hand and at his face and at the stars beyond his face, and she said, "Yes, Cyrus, I will." He put the ring on her finger, and it fit as though it had always been hers, which she supposed, in the way of things meant to be, it always had been. The town of Caldwell received the news of their engagement with the varied range of reactions that all small towns produce when something changes. Most people were warm, in the genuine or politely warm categories. Emmett Walsh shook Cyrus's hand with visible emotion. Solomon bought a round of drinks at the saloon that he could barely afford, which was the kind of thing he did. Mr. Beaumont left a poetry book on the kitchen table with a page marked at a poem about beginnings, and she read it twice and cried once, quietly and briefly, in the manner that good things sometimes earn. Harriet Dunmore sat her down at the kitchen table the evening after the news spread and poured 2 cups of coffee and said, "You know that when you marry you will have to leave here." "I know," Abigail said. "You could keep working," Harriet said. "There is no rule that says a married woman cannot cook for a boarding house." "I could," Abigail agreed. "But I think Cyrus's house needs more attention than his house is currently getting. Have you seen the state of his kitchen?" Harriet laughed, and then her expression softened into something unguarded. "You deserve this," she said, which was not a thing Harriet said easily, because Harriet believed in deserving being something you earned rather than inherited. Coming from her, it meant considerable things. "Thank you," Abigail said, "for hiring me when you did not have to." "I hired a cook," Harriet said, waving this away. "You happen to also be a good person. That was your doing, not mine." They were married in October, just over a year after Abigail had stepped off the stagecoach into the Caldwell dust. The ceremony was in the small church on the east side of Front Street, performed by the circuit minister who came through every 6 weeks, and the whole thing was modest, and precisely what she wanted, a room of people who actually knew them, the honest words, the light through the church windows going amber with autumn. Emmett Walsh was there. Solomon was there, having found work enough to stay in Caldwell through the fall. Harriet Dunmore was there in her good dress, which was black because Harriet was not a woman who changed her wardrobe for occasions. Mr. Beaumont was there with a poem he had written for the occasion, which he was persuaded not to read aloud in the interest of time, but which he presented in written form in an envelope, and which Abigail kept her whole life. She wore the blue-gray calico and carried a spray of late-season wildflowers that Emmett had gotten from somewhere. And when she walked down the aisle and saw Cyrus standing at the front of that small room with his hands at his sides and his eyes on her, and an expression that had nothing managed or concealed in it, just open, clear love, she held her spine straight and walked toward him like a woman who knew exactly where she was going. The minister asked for her name, and she said, "Abigail Fletcher Haskins," putting both names in, keeping all of herself, and Cyrus heard it, and the corner of his mouth moved upward, and she answered that with a smile of her own. They exchanged vows, and they exchanged rings, and Cyrus kissed her in front of that room of people with the same directness and honesty he brought to everything, and she kissed him back the same way, and it was the first time in a very long while that she had been entirely, unguardedly present for something. The house that Cyrus owned was behind the livery, separated from it by a small garden that had been more or less abandoned in his years of bachelor occupation. It had 3 rooms, a kitchen, a main room and a bedroom, and a porch that faced west, which caught the evening sky in the way that west-facing porches on the plains always do, with an almost theatrical quality of color and light. The kitchen needed considerable attention, which she gave it with professional satisfaction. The garden she looked at through the kitchen window and began making plans for. The first weeks of marriage were the ordinary, extraordinary weeks of 2 solitary people learning how to share a life, and there were adjustments and negotiations and small moments of friction that were part of it, and there was a great deal of laughter, and there was the discovery that being held at night by someone who chose to be, there was the kind of thing that rebuilt you from the inside in ways you had not known needed rebuilding. She told him, one night in November when the wind was loud against the windows, and the wood stove ticked warmly and they were lying in the dark together, every detail of the trial. Not the version she had told on the porch on that first day, abbreviated and careful, but all of it. Harlan Bede, the blood, the deputy's face when he looked at her, the 12 men in the jury box and the way not one of them had quite met her eyes. The day the acquittal came and the circuit judge had read it aloud, and she had sat very still and felt nothing but exhausted, because the feeling of relief she had expected had not arrived in time for the announcement. Cyrus listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You should have had better." "I know," she said. "The world should have done better by you." "It did not," she said, "but it is doing better now." He pulled her closer, and she pressed her face against the warmth of his chest, and she thought that grief and love can occupy the same space without diminishing each other, that she could hold all of what had happened to her and still be standing here in this house, in this warmth, in this life that was now genuinely hers. Winter was kind that year, or at least kinder than the previous one. She planted the garden in the spring, and it turned out she had a real gift for it, vegetables and sunflowers, and a row of roses along the fence that Cyrus professed to be confused about in terms of their utility, but which he never failed to look at with a particular expression that she correctly identified as pleasure. He built her a better kitchen shelf in February, which took 3 weekends and was crooked by a 1/4 inch on the left end, and she kept it exactly as it was because the 1/4 inch was evidence that he had built it himself with care. She learned his rhythms, and he learned hers, and the learning was one of the best things she had ever done. He rose before her, which surprised her because she was an early riser. He had coffee ready by the time she came into the kitchen, which was the domestic equivalent of a daily declaration. He talked more in the evenings than in the mornings, and she was the opposite, and they had negotiated this without discussion in the way that good partners negotiate things, by paying attention and adjusting. In the spring of 1884, she found out she was going to have a child. She told him on the porch in the evening, in April, with the garden just showing its first green along the fence line, and the sky going pink over the prairie. She had been turning the knowledge over since that morning, handling it carefully, and then she realized she was trying to manage her own joy, which was something she had been doing for years and which was not necessary anymore, not with him. "Cyrus," she said, "we are going to have a baby." He set down the cup he had been holding and looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen him wear before. It was larger than any of his other expressions, uncontained in a way that was unusual for him, and she thought she saw his eyes brighten with something that was not sadness. "Truly," he said. "Truly," she said. He reached for her hand and held it and looked at the garden and then at the sky, and she watched him sitting with it, the way he sat with everything important feeling the full weight of it before saying anything. Then he said, "I did not think I would have this." And the simplicity of it told her everything about the years of solitude he had lived through, all those miles of trail and all those nights under the stars he had described, and all the building of something that did not yet have a shape. "Well," she said, squeezing his hand, "now you do." The child was a boy, born in January of 1885, in the bedroom of the house behind the livery, while Harriet Dunmore, who turned out to be an experienced midwife in addition to her other qualities, managed the proceedings with efficient authority, and Cyrus waited in the kitchen and rebuilt the woodstove fire approximately 4 times due to an inability to be still. They named him Thomas for no complicated reason. It was a name they both liked, plain and solid and good, like the things they valued. Thomas Fletcher Haskins, which kept both parts of her intact and gave him all of his father. Thomas was, from his first hours, a person of strong opinions and vigorous lungs, and he brought to the house behind the livery a new kind of noise and warmth that Abigail had not anticipated needing and found, now that it was here, that she had been waiting for it all along. Cyrus took to fatherhood the way he took to everything he cared about, seriously and completely, with full attention. He carried Thomas in the crook of his arm while making rounds of the livery in the early mornings, talking to him the way he talked to the horses, which was to say with quiet competence and the assumption that understanding was present. Solomon, who had stayed in Caldwell and found work at the freight yard, became Thomas's unofficial uncle, which was a role he accepted with evident delight. The garden expanded. The house grew a second bedroom, which Cyrus built himself over 2 months in the summer of 1885 with help from Emmett Walsh and Solomon, and a level of carpentry ambition that occasionally exceeded his skill, but always resulted in something that stood and was functional. The crooked shelf was joined by a bookshelf that was slightly less crooked, and a porch railing that was perfectly level and which Cyrus was excessively proud of. Mr. Beaumont, the retired schoolteacher, decided in 1885 that Caldwell needed a proper lending library, which it did not have, and he recruited Abigail to help him organize it. She ran the lending library out of the back room of the church 2 afternoons a week, and this gave her something she had not had since before Dodge City, a place in the community that was straightforwardly hers, a contribution that was acknowledged. Women came to the library. They came for the books and stayed for the conversation, and gradually Abigail became a person that the women of Caldwell brought their concerns to, not because she had appointed herself, but because she listened without rushing to conclusions and offered thoughts without making them mandates. She did not preach about injustice, but she noticed it, and when she could do something small about it, she did. A woman whose husband drank too much and spent their household money. Abigail quietly connected her with resources for keeping household accounts separate. A young woman who had come to town as a domestic worker and was being underpaid. Abigail helped her understand what the going wage was and provided language for asking for it. Small things, concrete things, the kind of work that does not get remembered in history but gets felt in lives. Franklin Patterson moved out of Caldwell in the summer of 1885. A business opportunity in Wichita, he said, which most people understood to mean his store had not done as well as he hoped in recent years, possibly because a portion of the town had shifted its custom to another establishment after the events of January 1883. Patterson came to say goodbye to Abigail on the day they left, which surprised her. Dot was not entirely at ease, but she stood in the doorway of the lending library and said, "I should have said something that day at the bread table." "You did not have to," Abigail said. "I know," Dot said, "but I should have." She paused. "You have made this a better town than you found it." It was, Abigail thought, a complicated compliment from a woman whose husband had done the opposite. But she took it in the spirit it was offered, and wished Patterson a safe journey to Wichita, and meant it. Thomas turned 2 in January of 1887, walking by then and talking nearly constantly. with the characteristic Haskins' focus on whatever was directly in front of him, and his mother's tendency to watch the faces of people carefully before engaging. He was a solid child with dark hair that curled in the back and Abigail's gray eyes, and he had, from an early age, a deep attachment to the horses at the livery, which gave Cyrus a satisfaction that he expressed by teaching him the names of every horse by the time Thomas was 2.5. In the spring of that year, Abigail found herself pregnant again, and this time the news was received with a kind of practiced joy, still real, still full, but more settled, the way the second season of something good feels when you have learned to trust that it keeps coming. Their second child was a girl, born in November of 1887, and they named her Ruth, which was Cyrus's mother's name, and which sat in the house like a quiet honor. Ruth was quieter than Thomas and more watchful, and took to books before she could read them, sitting for long minutes turning pages with the intense expression of someone reading who has not yet acquired the tool but refuses to admit it. Thomas, at almost 3, received his sister with the pragmatic equanimity of a child who had been told something was coming and filed it under information rather than disruption. He patted her head with careful force and then went back to his toy horse, having performed his fraternal duties satisfactorily. The house was full now in the way that full means something, not just people and bodies, but life in its particular noise and warmth and complication. The lending library continued. The livery continued. Cyrus added a proper blacksmithing corner to the livery in 1888 and hired a young man named Jesse, who was 17 and enormously strong and had come up from Texas looking for work, and trained him with the same patience he brought to everything. Jesse turned out to be exceptional, and in 2 years was handling half the work himself, which gave Cyrus time he had not had before. He used some of this time to take Abigail on the drives out to the prairie that she had always enjoyed, the rise north of the cattle pens, which was still their place, and further out, deeper into the rolling grassland, where you could go a mile from the nearest building and feel the full, open scale of the continent they were standing on. These drives were some of the best hours of her adult life. They talked and they were silent in equal measure, and both were good. She talked to him, on these drives, about things she had never talked to anyone about, the particular quality of shame that had lived in her after the trial, the way it had made her feel that her own name was an accusation. She told him that what he had done on that Saturday morning at the spring market, calling her name across the street in front of everyone, had done something to her that she had not expected. It had not fixed anything exactly, but it had broken something. It had broken the hold that the trial's version of her name had on her. He had said it like it was hers, and it had become hers again. He listened to this carefully, and then he said, "I said it because it is a good name. It is your name." I did not see any reason to act otherwise. Most people did, she said. Most people were wrong, he said simply. She laughed, and the prairie took the sound and dispersed it in every direction over the grass, and it was exactly as large as she felt in that moment. In 1889, Caldwell began to change. The cattle drives that had defined the town for 15 years were in decline. The railroads had expanded, the fences had gone up across the rangelands, and the old trail town rhythms were shifting. Some businesses closed. Some families moved on to the new territories opening in what would soon be Oklahoma. The town did not die, but it settled into a different kind of life, smaller, quieter, more domestic and less transient. For Abigail and Cyrus, this change was not unwelcome. The town that remained was one that knew them, that had watched them build their life, that had adjusted itself around the fact of them. The lending library grew because the women of a quieter town had more time to read, and Abigail expanded it into 2 rooms by the end of the year, with funding from a combination of the church and a small grant she wrote and submitted to a women's education organization in Kansas City. Emmett Walsh married a schoolteacher who came to town in the spring of 1889, a decisive woman named Clara, who immediately identified the lending library as an asset and offered to run a reading group on Tuesday evenings, which became one of the consistent social events of the Caldwell week. Emmett and Clara came to supper at the house behind the livery, frequently enough that Thomas and Ruth considered them family, which they were, in the way that matters. Solomon had married too, in 1887, a woman from Arkansas named Martha who had come west with her family, and who made a claim on Solomon's heart that he described as inevitable, which was the most romantic thing he had ever said about anything. They lived 2 streets over, and their children, 3 of them by 1890, were in and out of the Haskins house with such regularity that the back door had acquired a different quality of use than the front. The territory was changing, and the world was pressing in at its edges, but the life they had built was rooted in something that did not depend on the external conditions of a cattle town or a trail or a market. It depended on the people inside it. In 1890, Thomas turned 5 and started at the school that had been improved by Clara Walsh's professional attention, and he went with the determination of a child who expected to master things, which he mostly did, and came home each day with the particular exhausted satisfaction of someone who has used their brain hard and is ready for supper. Ruth, at 2½, received him at the door each afternoon, as if his return were a significant event requiring acknowledgement, which Thomas accepted with the dignity appropriate to the role of important older brother. It was in that autumn, when the leaves on the cottonwoods down by the creek were going gold, and the sky was the deep, polished blue of October on the plains, that Abigail sat on the porch in the evening after the children were in bed and Cyrus came out and sat beside her with 2 cups of coffee, and they were quiet for a while looking at the western sky. "I have been thinking," she said, "about how different this is." "Different from what?" he asked. "From what I thought my life would be," she said. "From what I thought was possible after everything." He was quiet, waiting for her to say what she needed to say. "I remember standing in Dodge City after the acquittal," she said, "and thinking that the world had decided I was a particular kind of person and that there was nothing I could do about it. That the name Abigail Fletcher was permanently attached to the thing that had happened and that I would spend the rest of my life carrying it like something broken." She looked at him. "And now," she said, "when I say my name, all of it does not feel like that. It feels like mine. It feels like something good." He looked at her with the same steadiness he had been looking at her with for 8 years, and he said, "It is something good." "You helped with that," she said, "considerably." "You did the work," he said. "I just said a name." "You said it like it mattered," she said. "That was the thing." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat with the coffee and the evening sky and the sounds of the house around them, the small sounds of children breathing in their beds, the particular tick and settle of a house that is holding people inside it, and she thought, this is what it was all for, not the trial, not the shame. Not the long, cold journey from Dodge City to a stagecoach to a boarding house kitchen. But all of it, all the ground she had covered to arrive here, had been worth arriving. The years that followed laid themselves down quietly and well. There were ordinary hardships, a bad winter, a horse that broke a leg at the livery and had to be put down, which Cyrus felt more than he said, a sickness that moved through Thomas's school one spring and kept the house anxious for 2 weeks until everyone recovered. There were ordinary joys, Thomas's first successful ride on a horse, which Cyrus supervised with the intensity of a man who considers this a fundamental milestone. Ruth's discovery of reading, which happened one afternoon with such completeness that she simply sat down with a primer and did not come up for air. The discovery, in 1891, that they would have a 3rd child, which arrived in February of 1892 as another boy, whom they named Henry, and who from his first days had a personality of such sunny equanimity that everyone in the house was grateful for the balance he provided. Henry was born into a household that had found its rhythm, and he settled into it with the ease of someone who has arrived exactly where they are supposed to be. He was round-cheeked and good-natured, and had Cyrus's way of focusing completely on whatever was directly in front of him, and Abigail watched this in him with a love that had the particular texture of recognizing someone you already know in a new form. Jesse, the young man from Texas who had been working the livery since 1888, had become indispensable by 1891, skilled and responsible and loyal in the way that people become loyal when they have been treated fairly, which is a simpler transaction than it sounds, but one that not everyone manages. He and Cyrus worked well together, and the livery had expanded to include a proper smithy and a carriage repair service, which was busier than it might have been 10 years earlier as the town's population shifted from transient drovers to established families who needed farm equipment maintained. The library became, by 1892, the thing that Abigail was known for in the way that she had once, briefly and terribly, been known for something else. She had built it from a back room in a church to a two-room operation in its own building, funded by the women's organization, the town council, and a number of private donors who included Cyrus as the most significant. Women learned there and read there and met there and occasionally settled significant disputes of the domestic and social variety there, and the space had a quality of welcome that people mentioned without always being able to say exactly why it felt that way. She knew why. It felt that way because she had built it to feel the way she had needed a space to feel, in those early months in Caldwell, when a room where you could simply exist without being assessed for your history was the most valuable architecture in the world. On an afternoon in October of 1893, she stood in the library after the last visitor of the day had left, straightening shelves and listening to the afternoon wind against the windows, and she thought about the stagecoach, the carpet bag, the boarding house kitchen in the dark before 4 in the morning, the way she had not said her own name in full without flinching for years, the way it had sat in her mouth like something to be managed. She thought about Cyrus calling her name across a market street in May of 1883, in front of the whole town, without ceremony and without hesitation, like the most natural thing in the world. She thought about herself, standing taller. She locked the library for the evening and walked home along the familiar street, past the hardware store and the church and the general store, different owners now than Franklin Patterson's time, and past the rise at the edge of town, where the prairie began its long roll toward the horizon, and down the familiar block to the house behind the livery, where the kitchen window was warm with lamplight, and she could see through the glass the shapes of her life. Cyrus at the table, Thomas and Ruth doing their lessons across from him, Henry in his high chair, the ordinary miraculous arrangement of people who have been given to each other and know the value of what they hold. She opened the door and stepped inside, and the warmth of the kitchen and the smell of the supper she had left on the back of the stove came up around her, and Thomas said, "Mama," without looking up from his arithmetic, and Ruth said, "Mother, I read the whole of chapter 4, with the triumph of someone announcing a significant conquest, and Henry put his arms straight up in his particular way of saying without words that he would like to be picked up. And Cyrus looked up from his own reading and looked at her the way he had been looking at her since that first morning of biscuits and coffee, and a near collision in the hallway of the Red Mesa boarding house, which was to say completely, honestly and with everything he had. She crossed the kitchen and picked up Henry, who settled against her shoulder with the confidence of someone who has never doubted his welcome, and she bent and kissed the top of Thomas's head, which he tolerated with the dignity of a 6-year-old who has not yet decided whether affection is embarrassing, and she touched Ruth's shoulder, and then she sat down across the table from her husband. "Long day," he said. "Good day," she said. Mrs. Connolly's daughter learned to write her own name today at the library, all by herself, he smiled. "That is something." "It is," she said. "It is everything, really, writing your own name, saying it, knowing it is yours." He looked at her across the lamplight and the arithmetic books and the supper things, and he knew exactly what she meant, and she knew that he knew, and that knowing, being known, fully and truly, by this man in this house, in this life that had been rebuilt from the ground up and was standing solid, was the thing she had not known she was walking toward all those years ago when she stepped off the stagecoach with a carpet bag and a borrowed version of herself. She was Abigail Fletcher Haskins, and she said it without flinching, without managing, without the careful recalibration that had once been necessary to survive the simple act of having a name. She said it with the ease of someone who has come home to a thing she thought was lost, and found it not only waiting but larger and better than she had left it. Outside, the Kansas night settled over Caldwell with the vastness of open country stars from horizon to horizon, wind in the remaining cottonwoods down by the creek, the distant sound of Jessie shutting the livery for the night, and inside the house behind the livery, a woman who had once been silenced by a world that chose not to hear her sat at her own table in her own kitchen, in the warmth of her own life, and knew herself completely. Thomas finished his arithmetic and looked up and said, "Papa, can we go see the horses tomorrow before school?" "If you are up early enough," Cyrus said. "I will be up early," Thomas said, with all the certainty of someone who has never once failed to be up early when a horse was involved. Ruth was already deep in Chapter 5, having declared Chapter 4 a victory, and moved immediately on to the next one, which was exactly what her mother would have done. Henry fell asleep against Abigail's shoulder, with the total trust of someone for whom the word safe is not abstract but physical and present and smelling of his mother's kitchen. Cyrus reached across the table and rested his hand on hers, and she turned her hand over and held it, and they sat like that in the lamplit kitchen while the night deepened over the prairie, and it was everything, and it was theirs, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was the life that had been waiting on the other side of all the hardest miles, faithful and patient and warm.